Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, representing the ruling Southwest African People's Organization, or SWAPO, has been elected as Namibia's first female president in a contentious election. The 72-year-old secured over 57% of the vote, while her closest competitor, Panduleni Itula of the Independent Patriots for Change, or IPC, received 26%. Opposition parties have rejected the election results, citing widespread irregularities, and they are planning to contest them in court. And with us is Dr. Piet Croukamp from Northwest University, who observed the elections on the ground. Hi, Dr. Piet Croukamp. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Nice to have you.
So the opposition parties say there may have been irregularities. Did you observe any of that on the ground?
Look, I've been around there for about 2 weeks in the run-up to the election, as well as on election day and a couple of days thereafter. There's nothing that convinced me or any other observers, independent observers, and I've spoken to some of the African Union observers. There was nothing there that convinced us, and that's early days, preliminary, convinced us that there was, on behalf of the ruling party, that there was some interference with the election. But we do know that the Namibian Electoral Commission has experienced enormous logistical problems. The tents weren't up where the people supposed to vote weren't up early enough. The voting stations didn't open up in time. Quite often they didn't have enough ballots. And then, of course, they'd done everything by hand. There had to be a paper trail according to a court judgment about a year ago. And that means that it takes an enormous amount of time to get a single voter through the system, 5, 6, 7 minutes for a single voter to actually come in and leave the voting station. And the queues, sometimes 200, 300, 400 meters, even longer. It's a logistical nightmare, but I think it is down to a lack of proper administration of the process rather than any form of interference or corruption on behalf of the government.
They're going to have their first female leader then.
When I went to Namibia, I had my reservations about it. And I thought perhaps it's time for Panduleni Itula to take over. He was from SWAPO before. He started the new IPC party. He was hell-bent on saying that I promise you I will involve more foreign companies in the economy. We'll get new capital into the economy. We'll in some other way create new jobs. We will reinvigorate the industrial sector of Namibia. Those are the promises that all politicians make. But that was the things that I think made the right sounds. If you compare that to SWAPO, who keep on talking about the involvement of the state and state interventionism and empowerment and grant system that they want to implement, all big on spending as opposed to the big on creating new resources. That was Panduleni Itula's narrative. So I had my reservations, but while I was there, I started to listen to both of them talking on YouTube. And I must admit, there was just a little bit more credibility on the part of Ndaitwa. And the strange thing, something that really, really blew my mind in the beginning, I went around and I asked a lot of people, and I know that's not a sample, I represent a sample, but I asked a lot of white men, because I know a lot of white men in Namibia. I asked them, so who do you vote for? And you'll be surprised how many of them say, listen, man, it's a matter of better the devil you know than the one you don't know. So maybe it's better that SWAPO win the election. And some of them said, well, maybe it's better that Itula at least take over the presidency, and that is a more competitive system, because they think there's growing corruption, and a more competitive system will address that problem. But I also met a lot of them who said that as a person, Ndaitwa is just, there's just something about her that Itula doesn't have. She doesn't make promises that she probably can't keep. And the other thing is, everybody's been implicated in corruption, from the Croukamp right through all the top echelons and the structures of SWAPO, except Ndaitwa and the Minister of Finance. Those two, nobody's got nothing on them. And somehow I thought, well, maybe it's not a bad thing if Ndaitwa eventually wins this election. And I think that's where he's heading to. Yes, she seems to be, if you look at the preliminary results, she's even more popular than SWAPO itself. And when I went there, there were a lot of commentators who said there that while SWAPO might get 50 or 55% of the vote, they do not think Ndaitwa will get 50%. Well, it is proven to be wrong, and it's just the other way around.
So what else do we know about her, apart from the fact that she doesn't seem to be tainted by corruption?
She's an old struggle warlord. She comes from the 1990s, from the days of Sam Nujoma. She's been in the party. She's a cadre to the heart. She some people say, some people refer to her as a socialist, but I haven't seen or heard anything to that effect. That she believes in the party as a source of driving the economy. That's probably true. She's got higher hopes for the new oil exploration that's happening in Namibia now. She thinks that will save the economy because they have massive debt in Namibia as well. And also the hydrogen economy. She supports both those features in the private sector context. So it looks like she's a bit of a balance between old school socialists politically, but believing that the economy should be driven by the private sector. Much that you get in China, it's the same thing. But in that respect, you could refer to as a social democrat rather than a socialist, I think. She's saying the right things. She's saying the right things in many ways. I just, when I crossed the border into Botswana and I came back to South Africa, I thought, maybe I trust her just a little bit more than any of the other politicians that seeks to win the presidency of Namibia.
And so if we think about Namibia, why does it matter geopolitically or to Southern Africa?
Look, it plays virtually no role in the in the international political economy, but it has very close ties with Germany. It has very close ties with the Nordic countries. Those countries and Germany and Europe, Switzerland, even Austria. Those countries seem to have a humanitarian interest in Namibia. They somehow believe that it is possible to save Namibia from itself. And they invest heavily. I've spoken to NGOs that rely heavily on donor money uh, uh, for activities that they pursue. And they all say that it's easy. It's incredibly easy to get money for big projects in Namibia from European countries. As long as you manage it well, as long as it's viable projects, they say there's no problem to get money from those sources. So it seems like those countries, morally, they invest heavily in Namibia. Financially, they're quite willing to come to the party. And I think it's more a moral commitment that some of these countries in Europe are prepared to make because I think of the past, the historical links between Namibia and Germany and parts of Europe and the colonial legacy, etc. So it's not a large player in the international political economy, but it is something that parts of the European narrative, they seek to cherish that and defend it and seek to nurture it and to keep it going. And they themselves, and some of them have representatives there that I've spoken to, they just hope that it becomes a more competitive political system and that eventually good governance will become the norm as opposed to be the exception. And that somehow Namibia will do something about its debt problems, and then also its infrastructure is also crumbling about the logistics, the railways, the airport, the airport infrastructure is there seems to be a certain dilapidation setting in, and they would like to turn that around. But generally, there's a lot of optimism about the road that Namibia has taken, and that it hasn't turned to any form of radicalism. They haven't confiscated land in any radical way. The people living in the north are traders by and large. The Obambo is 52% of the Namibian society from the Obambo region. And they are traders by and large, and they seem to have no vested interest in an overburdened state. And so I think there's this relationship of historical relationship, one of hope, and then, of course, a moral obligation that the European economies have in a country like Namibia.
So do you think there's any risk of violence similar to what we saw in Mozambique if opposition parties are really unhappy about this election?
Not on the same scale, but it is possible that you can have small incidents here and there. But I don't think there's the capacity on that scale. On election day and the days before, and even a day or two thereafter, I've been around the country. And it was incredibly peaceful. But it could be that one or two individual local politicians who will be, as a consequence of what happens at the ballot box, maybe not make it into parliament, that they may stir some form of trouble in some area. But it'll be very limited. I expect no serious, not on the scale that we have in Mozambique. No, it can't happen there.
So how strong is the opposition? Because if you see what happened in South Africa, that we now have a government of national unity, what happened in Botswana, how strong are they?
Look, it's to a large degree it's ethnically based. There's the landless peoples movement, for instance, are by and large from the Nama people in the south. The party of Panduleni Itula cuts across the different regions, but largely an urban phenomenon. And all the other political parties, including the Republican Party, which is largely a white and religious type of configuration, they're all based on the identity of a certain group, either from the Hereres or from the Kavangus, or from the Damras or from the Namas. So it's the opposition parties are very, very small. They have only really three parties now. The one is SWAPO, of course, around about 50, 55, 60, maybe 60% of the vote. Then the party of Panduleni Itula, IPC, around about 25 to 30% of the vote. And the next party is that of SWATBoy, and he's from the Landless People's Movement and largely a Nama party. Thereafter, they all form a DA, not the DA, what the DTA. You remember them, the Democratic Turnal Alliance? Nowhere to be seen. They've transformed into a small Herero party. So there's not a lot of opposition, and I think that's the reason why a lot of people say that's the reason for the corruption. SWAPO has become complacent because there's no viable alternative for that. But that was before Geopolitical. You'll remember that President Pohamba got around about 70 to 80% of the support in the election. That has then dropped to 56% for Geopolitical, and he was a Damara, by the way, 56% for him. But that was with the rise of Panduleni Itula. And thereafter, when Geopolitical died, of course, now we have Nandi-Ndaitwa, and if she features around about 60% of the vote, then that's more or less where SWAPO is now. They've come down from 80% to around about 60% of the vote. So there is some form of formal opposition coming to the fore. It's not going to be this election. We won't see what we saw in Botswana in this election, or perhaps even seen in Zimbabwe, and most likely in Mozambique, because that's why we have the violence there. But it is possible that it's a lot more competitive this time around, and that maybe there will be the contestation in the legislature. It won't be possible for SWAPO to push through legislation that they need 2/3 for. They will still have a majority, and they can still pass 90% of all legislation. But it is a little bit more competitive, and that type of competitiveness, it also filters through to the media. Suddenly, I think the media has a vested interest in not only opposing SWAPO, but actually talking and dealing with the fact that there are other political parties that have a real stake in the political process now. I think the narrative will change in Namibia a little bit more. I think SWAPO will be more aware that what happened to Botswana can happen to them too. They will see that there's a rise in opposition structures. But more importantly, it is possible now. They've reached a threshold where it is possible that more groups can break away from SWAPO. There's a strong sense within, especially the urban areas of Namibia, that SWAPO has been there too long. In the previous election, for instance, Itula, he took virtually all the urban centers. He took control over that. He took them away from SWAPO. So once they lost the urban areas, naturally one would argue, well, what happens in the peri-urban areas? Because in the rural areas, they will always be strong. But there are so many peri-urban areas, Ndanga, Oshukati, Omaende. There's a lot of areas where there are high density but well-developed areas, which could be the next, call it peri-urban areas, to migrate away from SWAPO to other political parties. The important thing was that Itula is a Wambu. In other words, it's easier for people, because remember, SWAPO is a liberation party. It's easy to migrate from SWAPO to another political party if it shares that historical legacy of the liberation movement, like the IPC of Itula. That's why I think they get around about 30% of the vote. The other ethnic parties, opposition parties, because they're ethnically based, because they're in some other way, the liberation movement is actually associated with the Wambus, not necessarily with the Namas in the south or with the Basters of Rio, but it's associated with the Wambus. So if a political party or political configuration evolves that has shared that historical legacy of the liberation movement, then SWAPO could have more competition in the next 5 years.
What about internationally? Recently, one of the ministers said they might be interested in joining BRICS.
Yeah, look, it's such a small country, and China and Russia will probably take them in immediately. because they'll take any country who are relatively stable and prepared to join BRICS. But the economy is smaller than the economy of Johannesburg. In fact, a lot smaller. They have an economy maybe the size of Bloemfontein or Durban, maybe the size of Durban. So it can only be symbolically, but that's the one thing. The other thing is that they are so dependent on their relationship with the Germans and with the Nordic countries that I think they will be discouraged internationally by those partners, those countries, not to seem to be joining a particular side. Rather keep your non-alignment identity, because then it makes possible for us to deal with you and to make it to share the burden of economic development with you. Once you've joined BRICS ideologically, it could be that it becomes a little bit more troublesome to convince the people of those countries to keep on investing, to keep people of Germany to keep on investing in Namibia. But I think it's neither here nor there. The Germans and the Nordic countries will remain involved regardless of Namibia joining BRICS. But I've heard those sounds as well, yeah.
Well, Dr. Piet Croukamp, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.